In the spring of 2012, a crow was struck by a car on a residential street in Seattle and killed on impact. Within minutes, other crows had gathered. Not one or two, dozens. They lined the telephone wires above the body. They stood in the road around it. Researchers studying corvid behavior in that neighborhood documented what happened over the next several minutes. The crows stayed, silent, and then slowly dispersed. No signal anyone could identify triggered the departure. No obvious moment of conclusion. They were there, and then they weren't. Scientists call a crow funeral. They acknowledge immediately that this is an informal term. They don't have a better one yet. Because what the crows were doing, gathering, standing, leaving, doesn't fit any known category of survival behavior. They weren't protecting a nest. They weren't driving away a predator. They weren't competing for food. They seemed to be responding specifically to the fact that something was dead. And that is the question that has quietly unsettled animal cognition researchers for decades. Not whether animals feel pain, not whether they feel fear or attachment or joy. We've largely answered those. The harder question, the one that doesn't resolve cleanly, is whether any animal on this planet besides us actually understands what death is. Not just reacts to it, understands it. There is a significant difference. Start with sea otters, because sea otters are where that difference becomes visible. When a mother sea otter loses her pup, she carries the body, not briefly, for days, sometimes over a week. She holds it on her chest the way she would a living pup. She grooms it. She refuses to let it sink. Researchers tracking these mothers have documented them losing measurable body weight during these periods because they're too focused on the body to eat adequately. Eventually, the body deteriorates enough. Eventually, she lets go. The easy interpretation is grief. But grief, real grief, the kind that means something, implies an understanding of what has been lost. And here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. The harder possibility is that the mother otter isn't grieving in any meaningful sense. She's responding to the presence of her pup. The neural wiring that says keep the pup close, groom the pup, protect the pup, that wiring doesn't have a switch that flips off when the pup stops breathing. She may not know the pup is dead. She may only know that something is catastrophically wrong, and the only response available to her is to hold on. Or she may know exactly what happened and be choosing to hold on anyway. We cannot tell which one it is. That's not a gap in the research. That is the actual current state of the science. Geese mate for life. When one goose in a bonded pair dies, the surviving goose will sometimes leave the flock entirely. For a social migratory animal, this is not a small decision. Geese migrate together, feed together, sleep in groups specifically for protection. Leaving the flock is, by any objective measure, dangerous. And yet they do it. They'll wander alone for weeks, returning to locations the pair used to frequent. Biologists following these birds have documented changes in their posture, their feeding rate, their baseline alertness. A goose in this state looks, by every measurable behavioral indicator, like a depressed one. But the interpretation problem surfaces here too. A goose returning to a familiar pond is not necessarily looking for its dead partner. It might simply be following a behavior pattern that is still running. Go here with mate. The mate variable is gone. The behavior fires anyway. Is that grief? Is that memory acting on an absence that hasn't been processed? Is it something in between that has no name yet? Because the only language we have for inner experience is the language humans built for human experience? We don't know. In 2009, a researcher studying wild giraffes in Tanzania documented something with no precedent in the scientific literature. A mother giraffe stood over her dead calf for more than 3 days. She nudged the body repeatedly with her nose. She kept other animals away, including hyenas significantly larger than the calf. She didn't eat. She barely moved. Other giraffes in the area would approach occasionally, lower their necks toward the body, and walk on. She stayed. 3 days. In open savanna. For an animal whose primary survival strategy is constant vigilance against predators, standing motionless for 72 hours is not a neutral choice. Every survival instinct should have been compelling her to leave. She didn't leave. On the 4th day, She walked away and rejoined the herd. What changed? What registered on day for that hadn't registered on day 3? Did some neurological threshold finally cross? Some slow signal finally arrive? Or did her body simply reach the limit of what it could physically sustain, and biology make the decision her mind couldn't? We don't know that either. Here is the thing that should bother you more than it probably does. Almost everything we know about how animals respond to death comes from watching what they do. We observe behavior, then work backward, carefully, cautiously, sometimes not carefully enough, to infer what might be happening inside. But behavior is a fundamentally limited window into anything. Humans behave in ways that don't reflect interior experience all the time. We laugh at funerals. We feel nothing in the immediate moment of catastrophe and fall apart 6 months later in the middle of a grocery store. We attend the burial of someone we barely knew and cry anyway. We perform grief that isn't there. We conceal grief that is. If a species that couldn't access our language was studying us purely through observation, they would build a deeply incomplete and often misleading picture of what death means to us. So when we watch a crow standing on a telephone wire above a body, or a mother otter grooming a pup that has been dead for a week, we're working with the same constraint in reverse. We're looking through a keyhole. What's on the other side might be vast. It might be a small room. We genuinely cannot determine which from this side of the door. Western scrub jays, small, sharp birds in the corvid family, have been studied specifically for their behavior around conspecific death. When a jay dies near the territory of other jays, living birds will sometimes stop foraging entirely and gather at the site. They call loudly. Researchers who played recordings of these specific calls to other jays found that those birds responded immediately, abandoning food sources to move toward the location. They weren't protecting a nest. No predator explained a response. They were responding specifically to the death itself, as if the information needed to travel, as if the community needed to know. Whether that constitutes anything like human mourning is a separate question, but it is organized, purposeful seeming behavior centered on a death that serves no obvious immediate survival function. That category, organized, death-specific, survival purpose absent, is genuinely difficult to explain away. There's a concept in animal cognition called object permanence, the understanding that something continues to exist even when you can't perceive it. Human infants develop this at around 8 months. Many animal species have it. Death is the inverse problem. Death requires understanding that something which existed is now permanently, irreversibly not there, gone in a way that doesn't reverse. That is a significantly harder cognitive leap. It requires not just knowing something is absent, but knowing that the absence is final. Whether any non-human animal actually makes that leap is genuinely unresolved science. Some researchers argue that the otter, the goose, the giraffe are all operating at the level of absence. Something is missing. The neural circuits that expected that thing to be present are misfiring. The result is distress, searching behavior, disruption of normal routine. But it's not comprehension of death as a concept. It's a system responding to a broken expectation. Others argue this definition is too narrow. That comprehension doesn't have to resemble human comprehension to be real. That a goose wandering alone back to a familiar pond might be doing something that deserves the same word we use for what we do at grave sites. The bees are probably the most philosophically interesting case. When a bee dies inside the hive, worker bees remove the body. They carry it out and drop it some distance from the entrance. This is likely hygienic. A decomposing body can spread disease. Practical enough. Instinctual enough. Not particularly striking on its own. But then researchers did this. They applied oleic acid, the specific chemical compound a bee's body releases as it decomposes, to a living bee. The workers carried that living bee out of the hive anyway. While it was still alive, while it was still moving, they weren't responding to the bee. They were responding to the chemical signature of death. And they could not distinguish between the two. So either bees have no concept of death at all and are running pure chemical programming, or the chemical program is their concept of death, built from completely different materials than ours, operating through mechanisms that have nothing in common with human cognition, but still a system for identifying and responding to the end of life. The second possibility is the more interesting one. The idea that something like recognition of death might exist in a form so different from human cognition that we don't recognize it as cognition at all. Maybe the question itself is framed wrong. Understanding is a human word. It describes a human process. When we ask whether animals understand death, we're asking whether they do what we do, the way we do it, through the same internal machinery. But a giraffe standing over a dead calf for 72 hours in open predator territory, refusing to eat, chasing away animals that could kill her, that is not nothing. Something is happening there that is real. That has weight. That cost her something. Whether it fits our word, understanding might be the least important thing about it. What the crow funeral and the grieving goose and the mother otter and the group of 20 sperm whales holding silent position in the middle of the Atlantic all point toward is the same finding. Death lands on more species than we thought. It changes behavior in ways that can't always be accounted for by instinct or reflex or chemical signal alone. Something is happening in those minds when life ends near them. We just don't speak the language well enough yet to know exactly what.